The sound of splintering wood did not begin as a roar, it began as a whisper. A hairline sigh in oak, the almost musical fatigue of timber swollen with rain, the faint tap of water finding joints it should never have found. In the grand dining hall on Meeting Street, Charleston's lamps burned like floating suns beneath a ceiling Moses Carter knew more intimately than he knew the lines of his own hands. Outside, the storm leaned on the city with a drunkard's weight, gutters vomiting brown torrents, slate tiles shivering, palmettos combed flat by sheets of rain. Inside, William Barrett swirled the last mouthful of French brandy and inked a figure into his account book, one coppery lamp halo gilding his profile and the paper beneath it. He had 3 seconds no more to look up from the column of numbers and wonder why the plaster above him was dusting like flour. By then, the first joint had already let go. A rifle-shot crack split the room. Barrett's head jerked, eyes snapping toward the vaulted dark like a man roused from a dream into a nightmare that had merely been waiting its turn. A pepper of white rained onto the table. He pushed back, his chair habit slow, confidence slower, the practiced rituals of a man who believed his house obeyed him. The second joint failed with a sound like a great beast coughing. Somewhere beyond the panes hammered by rain, thunder rolled a lazy drum, masking the small, urgent noises only a carpenter would hear, tenons straining, pegs loosening, fibers tearing one after another. At the same moment, in the garden's wet breath, a man stood in shadow. He did not move. Moses' hat brim, and the night made a single outline. His face was unreadable. He watched through glass as carefully as he had once watched the living grain of oak, the slow logic of trees made into architecture. The beam he had chosen, the beam he had courted, weakened, coaxed toward betrayal, hung directly above Barrett's customary chair. Hadn't the man always returned to the same spot? Same brandy, same ledger, the same gloating silence only old money can afford. Predictable. Predictability is the mother tongue of structures and of men who imagine themselves permanent. The third joint went. The sound this time was not a crack, but a long-grown timber's confession. The center beam tipped, paused in a final, impossible grace, then dropped like a guillotine, the length of it scything air and lamplight, the weight of it translating 15 patient years into 10 merciless seconds. It hit Barrett square across the shoulders and drove him forward. The table exploded in a gasp of splinters and glass. Brandy threw a bright arc that caught the lamp flame. Flame kissed alcohol and danced, then died in the rain of plaster and smashed chandeliers. A rain inside answering the rain outside. Silence after catastrophe is never truly silent. Dust drifted in sheets. Tiny fires winked out. A hinge squealed and stopped, aimless as a last breath. And then, with a series of small, inexorable collapses, secondary failures in a system that had lost its spine, the rest of the ceiling came down. 2 tons of timber and slate and decorative plaster surrendered their handsome geometry and became ruin. What had been symmetry became heap. What had been pride became weight. Moses did not flinch. He waited longer than necessary, counting not by seconds but by instincts honed across a lifetime of listening to wood. He knew how buildings died. The first violence is spectacle. The true danger always lives in the after. He watched for the slow settling that means the load has found its final bed. He watched for movement where no movement should be. Nothing. Only the storm, clapping its distant hands. Through the window, the dining hall was a tomb. Moses could make out the spilled ledger, its soaked pages fluttering like a wounded bird. Figures, accounts, debts, ink dissolving into brown rivulets, as if numbers too were mortal. He let that image fix itself, the arithmetic of ownership melting in the very house it had built. He turned from the glass and stepped back into the rain. The water welcomed him without question. He had memorized the paths where stepping stones rose a hair higher than the lawn, knew which planks in the side porch would complain under a man's weight, which gate latch needed 2 careful breaths before it would give without a clack. Every creak in this place had been his overseer. Tonight, each would be his accomplice. The garden swallowed him, then the carriage lane, then the night streets of Charleston, where rain made a silver skin on cobbles and the lamps wore frosted halos. Houses hunched like gossipers behind their shutters. The church bells kept their silence. In the lanes between warehouses, water ran like quicksilver snakes toward the harbor. He walked not fast and not slow, the gait of a man who belongs to the hour. Behind him, the house that had owned his hands and hours had become a broken throat incapable of calling his name. He imagined, for a moment, the overseer's cottage lamp flaring to life, imagined the first shout, the first scramble for tools, imagined fingers prying at beams too heavy for any living man to lift. He did not imagine Barrett crawling free. He had engineered the room to resist mercy. 3 miles of rain and darkness lay between the plantation and the wharf. He had paced it in daylight 100 times with his eyes closed. Past the bakery whose chimney always forgot its smoke when the wind veered east, past the alley of fishmongers where salt cut the nose even at midnight, past the German's cooperage, where barrels slept in rows like well-behaved children. The harbor rose before him in plank smell and tar light, a forest of masts tossing slow heads against the black. Beyond, the Atlantic wore the storm as a shawl. Moses paused beneath a dripping crane and closed his eyes. He could still feel in the pads of his fingers every joint he had set wrong, every wedge he had omitted, the careful shaving of a bracket until it was held by the politeness of friction. Months of small apostasies. He had taught the ceiling the language of failure, and then waited for weather to speak it aloud. He had waited 15 years. 15 years earning trust, mapping habits, studying the temperaments of both men and materials. Freedom, he had learned, is a structure too. It requires a blueprint, a schedule, patience a mason would envy. When he opened his eyes, he turned toward the moored merchantman he had chosen in his thoughts already a dozen times. Freedom's dawn, a name a superstitious sailor might distrust, a name a practical man could not ignore. She would quit the harbor on the morning tide, bound south where American law grew weak and memory dissolved in other languages. Moses had a cabin purchased with coins collected and hidden over years so clever, even he had forgotten some of their hiding places until just last week. He had a new name folded in his pocket and sewn into the lining of his coat. Matthew Freeman. How simple a miracle a pen can make. He did not believe in omens. He believed in the way oak behaves after 3 days of August rain. He believed in the predictability of habits. He believed men who say mine often enough eventually mistake themselves for immortal. Still, as lightning stitched the harbor and stitched it again, he permitted one indulgence. He imagined the dining hall as it had been, the first night of its unveiling candles multiplying themselves in crystals, ladies' laughter chiming, polished floors reflecting wealth so eagerly it almost seemed virtuous. He imagined the compliments, Barrett, this ceiling, and remembered how he had stood in a doorway, hands clean, face blank, a shadow among chandeliers. He wondered how many of those guests would recall the room now not for its grandeur but for the way it ended, a cautionary tale with plaster in its teeth. Behind him the city exhaled a long, wet breath. No alarms yet. In the heavy downpour most men slept. The storm had shouldered its way between neighbors and their business. He walked the wharf, found the gangway he had memorized, and presented a slip of paper already whispered over with arrangements. No questions if the coins rang true. The night watchman glanced, grunted, and stepped aside, rain running off the bill of his cap in neat strings. In the dim belly of the ship, rope creaked and wood answered, a conversation Moses understood. He took the steps down as if descending into a chapel where one's life could be renamed. In his berth, the straw smelled of salt and someone else's sweat. He hung his wet coat and sat on the narrow bunk, listening. The ship's ribs spoke softly. Farther out, waves shouldered each other. He closed his eyes and saw, not the crushed body under the beam, but the ledger dissolving. The math of a world he had learned how to subtract. He felt no triumph, only a quiet, solid thing settling inside him, like a foundation finding earth. Guilt would come, doubt would come with it, but the old arithmetic had ended. A different calculus waited, measured in classrooms, in roofs that kept off rain without keeping out dignity, in boys taught to read after the lamps went cold. Above him, the storm eased a notch. Tomorrow, when the tide favored them, Freedom's dawn would slip its moorings and nose its way past Fort Sumter's watch and into a wider story. In Charleston, a locked room would begin its long rumor. The city would decide whether God or negligence or bad luck had broken a rich man's house. It could not imagine the truth, that the house had been taught to fall by the hands that built it. This is where we begin, with a ceiling that obeyed a different master, with a death that looked like weather, with a man who turned the tools of his bondage into a map. The night of the collapse was not an end, it was the hinge. The long door of 15 years had just swung open. Charleston, 1818. The air smelled of salt and money, of river water and indigo, of sweat that was not freely given. On Meeting Street, auctioneers' voices bounced off brick walls, their cadence half commerce, half sermon. Beneath their words, chains sang the counterpoint. It was there that William Barrett, a rising planter in his mid-30s with ambitions to outshine Charleston's aristocracy, laid down $800, an extraordinary price for one man. But Barrett was not buying mere muscle. He was buying hands, eyes, and a mind that had already learned the secret grammar of wood. The name called out that day was Moses Carter, 22 years old. Broad in the shoulders, his palms mapped by old blisters. He did not resist. Men rarely did in Charleston's slave market. Resistance was purchased out of them before the bidding even began. But in Moses' dark eyes lived a stillness others mistook for submission. Only those who understood wood could read it correctly. It was the stillness of patience, of strength waiting for the right season to bend. Barrett had no intention of sending Moses into the fields. Cotton and rice demanded one kind of body. Architecture demanded another. Charleston in the early 1800s was a city obsessed with display. Its elites locked in a silent arms race of columns and cornices, chandeliers and imported marble. To command respect was to command space, and Barrett, with his plantation profits, craved a house that would whisper permanence into Charleston's gossiping parlors. He believed Moses would be the chisel to carve his ambitions into timber and stone. Moses was installed not among the field hands but in the carriage house, a token of favor and utility. He ate better than most enslaved people, scraps of lamb instead of cornmeal mush, and he was loaned out to wealthy neighbors who marveled at his craftsmanship. His wages, of course, returned to Barrett's purse, though Moses was occasionally allowed a copper or two, a cruel imitation of autonomy. Nights, when the master's children were done with their primers, Moses sat by lamplight, tracing letters until they no longer looked like fences but like doors. Literacy was dangerous, yet wood itself had always been a text to him, its rings recording seasons of hardship and rain. To read a book was only to extend a gift he already possessed. Barrett's mansion soon grew beyond its original bones. Its front columns reached heavenward like whitewashed trees. Its dining rooms lengthened to hold ever longer tables, the better to display wealth. Moses's hands built each addition, balustrades that curved like river currents, a library where molding caught the afternoon light like lace, a staircase that seemed to float. Barrett's neighbors praised the design, never naming the designer. In their ledgers and conversations, Moses was merely Barrett's boy. Charleston itself was alive with contradictions. It was the wealthiest city in the South, its port crowded with ships fat with rice and indigo. Yet beneath the lace parasols and marble foyers, nearly half its population lived in bondage. Enslaved artisans, masons, smiths, carpenters were the invisible skeleton of Charleston's beauty. They raised churches whose bells they would never ring for themselves. They carved furniture that would outlive their names. In the city's heartbeat, Moses was one of many, but his gift set him apart. He saw grain not as obstacle but as map. He understood where oak wanted to bend, where cypress would sing. White carpenters muttered that he had the gift. Some even said it was supernatural, that he could hear a tree's destiny before the first cut. For Barrett, this meant profits and prestige. For Moses, it meant chains plated with gold. Every morning began with the sound of Barrett's voice calling his name. Every night ended in a shed fit for a mule. He lived in the paradox of being valued but never respected, trusted for his genius but denied his humanity. And yet, as the years drew forward, something began to harden inside him, like sap darkening into amber. He built because he had no choice, but he remembered because he could not forget. He remembered the faces of men sold beside him who had gone to the fields to die. He remembered the auctioneer's voice, sanctifying theft with a hymn of commerce. He remembered that to Barrett, he was not Moses. He was property. The seed of patience grew, watered by every insult disguised as privilege, by every structure that bore his signature but not his name. And when the seed finally split, its roots would creep quietly into the very beams of the house that Barrett believed would immortalize him. For now, in 1818, Charleston saw only a planter expanding his mansion and a young carpenter shaping timber. It did not see the blueprint taking shape in the shadows, a design not for a room, but for a reckoning. By 1825, William Barrett's hunger for grandeur had outgrown even the mansion that already dwarfed most of Charleston. He had money, he had land, but there was always more to prove. His wife Eleanor had died in childbirth that spring, leaving behind not a son but a stillborn child, and a house haunted by silence. Grief twisted itself into ambition, and Barrett did what men of his kind so often did: he built. As if stone and timber could fill the emptiness a child's cry never would. For Moses, the expansion was both curse and cage. He worked from dawn until the lamps guttered, shaping wood into rooms where Barrett could drown his sorrow in gatherings and display. The library, with its high ceilings and intricate crown molding, carried Moses's fingerprint in every angle. The breakfast room's hand-carved wainscoting bore the hours of his bent back. The grand staircase curved upward like a living thing, polished until it shone like a serpent's skin. Charleston's society praised the artistry, never questioning whose artistry it was. To the outside world, Barrett was a generous master. He allowed Moses a measure of privilege rare among slaves. Moses slept apart from the field hands in the carriage house, where a breeze might occasionally stir through the shutters. He ate meat when others gnawed corn husks. He could keep a coin or two when Barrett rented him out to wealthy friends. These privileges did not go unnoticed. Other slaves watched him with a mixture of envy and sorrow. Privilege, they knew, was only a gilded shackle, and Moses knew it too. Every evening after the day's sweat had dried on his shirt, he returned not to a home but to a place he did not own. A man who built libraries was not allowed to choose what he read. A man who built dining halls was not permitted to sit at their tables. The contradiction gnawed at him. The breaking point arrived in the winter of 1831, when Barrett unveiled his most ambitious project yet. A dining hall so vast it would be the envy of Charleston's elite, 40 feet long, 25 wide, with a vaulted ceiling supported by hand-hewn oak beams, selected by Moses himself. Barrett imagined it as a temple to his wealth, a stage for dinners where Charleston's aristocracy would marvel. One cold afternoon, Barrett led Moses to the cleared ground where the new room would rise. He gestured broadly at the space, his voice booming with pride. "This will be your masterpiece, Moses. When people see this hall, they'll know that William Barrett owns the finest carpenter in all of South Carolina." The word owns fell like a hammer blow. To anyone else, it might have sounded like praise, but to Moses, it was the revelation of a truth he had long known but never allowed to harden. In that moment, his talents were no longer blessings, they were chains. He was not a craftsman in Barrett's eyes, not an artist or an architect. He was a possession, like a thoroughbred horse or a silver goblet polished for display. He nodded, because he had to. He said the words Barrett expected. "Yes, master." But inside, something shifted. The stillness in him, the patience, became something sharper. It was as if a weight he had carried in silence suddenly revealed its true name. He was not free. He might never be free, unless he made himself so. The hall Barrett demanded would rise. Moses would shape it beam by beam, joint by joint. Guests would drink wine beneath its chandeliers and marvel at its scale. But Moses would know what no guest could ever suspect, that in the grain of its beams lay a secret design, a second blueprint, invisible to any eye but his own. Every stroke of his chisel, every joint he set, carried double meaning. To Barrett, it was obedience. To Moses, it was preparation. The room would be Barrett's monument. Yes, but it could also be his tomb. And in that realization, Moses's patience found its purpose. The winter of 1831 bled into spring, and with it came the sound of axes in the forests outside Charleston. Moses chose each oak himself, running his hands along the bark, listening as though trees spoke to him. Other carpenters trusted grain, weight, or age. Moses trusted instinct, sharpened by years of work that had taught him where strength lived, and where weakness could be coaxed into timber. Barrett believed the dining hall would be his triumph, but Moses quietly resolved that it would be his undoing. The design in Barrett's mind was a cathedral of wealth-vaulted ceilings, massive beams, chandeliers that rained French crystal light. The design in Moses's heart was something darker, something no draftsman could ink on paper, a hidden weapon written into wood. When he laid the first beams, Moses worked with deliberate intensity. His reputation allowed him to make decisions no one questioned. Where a joint should have been pegged twice, he pegged once. Where a beam should have sunk deep into the wall, he left it resting on supports he knew he could weaken later. To a casual eye, his work was flawless. To Moses, it was a chessboard, each piece placed not just for strength, but for eventual collapse. Every choice required calculation. Too much sabotage and the ceiling would fall before its time, perhaps on slaves or guests, ruining everything. Too little and it might never fall at all. He had to build a structure strong enough to stand, but brittle enough to betray at the right moment. He was building two halls at once, one visible to Charleston, one invisible, reserved for justice. Moses's fellow slaves sensed something shifting in him. They watched him work long after others rested, saw the way he touched the beams as though he were speaking to them. Some whispered admiration, others worried. They knew punishment for sabotage was death, slow and public, yet no one questioned him openly. Moses's silence commanded respect, and perhaps a little fear. Outside the mansion, Charleston thrived in its contradictions. The city boasted of its prosperity, grand homes, carriages clattering down cobblestone streets, gentlemen discussing politics beneath oaks draped in Spanish moss. Yet its wealth was mortared with suffering. Enslaved artisans built Charleston's facades, but their names never passed into records. A visitor could marvel at the city's beauty without seeing the chains that built it. Moses saw both. He worked as if driven by two masters, Barrett's ambition and his own secret oath. Each cut of his chisel was obedience on the surface, rebellion beneath. He thought of storms that had toppled strong trees, of termites that hollowed trunks silently for years. The hall he was raising would hold music, laughter, and the pride of men who saw themselves as gods. But it would also hold a lie hidden in the bones of the building waiting. By autumn of 1832, the hall stood complete. Its vaulted ceiling soared 20 feet, chandeliers glittered, and polished pine floors stretched like a mirror. Charleston's elite called it the finest room in the city. Barrett walked the space with triumph in his step, declaring it proof that he had tamed not just land and people, but beauty itself. Moses stood at the edge of the hall, expressionless. He knew what Barrett could not, that this masterpiece carried within it a second design, invisible yet inevitable, a room conceived to fail. In the quiet of his own thoughts, Moses told himself the truth. He had just built the first stage of a weapon that no overseer could whip out of him, no ledger could record, no law could undo. The house believed it was Barrett's monument. In time, it would reveal itself as Moses's. Christmas Eve, 1832. Candles burned in silver candelabras, crystal glasses clinked, and Charleston's most powerful families gathered beneath the new vaulted ceiling. Music swelled, laughter rang against the oak beams, and William Barrett basked in admiration. Guests marveled at the hall's scale, at the chandeliers glittering like constellations, at the craftsmanship they assumed reflected Barrett's vision. Barrett accepted their praise with a smile that curled like smoke. Moses, standing in the doorway with a tray in his hands, listened to their words as though they were nails hammered into his skull. They praised Barrett's room, Barrett's genius, Barrett's taste. Not one pair of eyes turned to the man who had bent the oak, joined the beams, coaxed the ceiling into flight. He smiled, faintly, because he had to. Inside, he counted the beams, the joints, the places where obedience hid betrayal. The irony was not lost on him. Here he stood, serving wine beneath a ceiling designed to someday bury the very man he served. The hall was finished, but the plan was not. Over the next year, Moses began the second phase, an invisible campaign of weakening. During routine maintenance, he would dampen certain joints with water, knowing wood swells, shrinks, and loosens under such treatment. Metal brackets were filed down with a craftsman's precision until they held only by friction. In hidden places, he carved away small hollows, invisible to the eye but fatal to strength. He worked slowly, as careful as a surgeon, so the structure would not betray him too soon. Charleston that year was a city of storms. Heavy rains arrived with unnerving regularity, afternoon skies darkening until the heavens seemed ready to crack. Thunder rolled across the harbor. Lightning stitched the clouds. For most, the storms were an inconvenience. For Moses, they were allies. He understood that water was the true accomplice in his design, the final hand that would press the ceiling toward collapse. Every drop of rain was a whispered promise. Barrett, meanwhile, carried on his rituals, blind to the storm gathering within his own house. Each evening he sat beneath the great center beam, brandy in hand, account books spread before him. He delighted in the solitude of the hall, in the sense that he alone presided over this cathedral of wealth. He never wondered if the silence above him was listening. For Moses, every day became a balancing act between patience and urgency. The structure had to fail, but not yet. He studied Barrett's habits, the regularity of his dinners, the rhythm of his nights. He knew exactly where Barrett would be when the ceiling fell, and he knew the window for his own escape would be narrow. A mistake meant discovery, and discovery meant death. In those months, the carriage house became his workshop not only for wood but for memory. He rehearsed routes through Charleston's alleys, memorized the schedules of ships leaving the harbor, and counted the coins he had hoarded from years of small allowances. Each night he checked the hidden seams of his plan, testing his patience as much as the beams themselves. There were moments when doubt gnawed at him. The thought of blood, even Barrett's, troubled his sleep, but the dreams of freedom burned brighter. He dreamed of a life where his children he did not yet have would never be sold, never branded property. He dreamed of hammer blows building homes for families, not monuments for masters. By the summer of 1833, the hall was a trap set and waiting. The beams moaned faintly in heavy weather, the joints strained, but the structure held. For now, Moses knew the moment was coming. All that was required was the right storm, and the patience to stand in its shadow until the ceiling obeyed. Barrett believed he had built himself a throne room. Moses knew it was a coffin waiting for the lid to close. By August 1833, the skies over Charleston turned restless. Afternoon storms slammed the city with clockwork precision, flooding streets, bending trees, and soaking every timber in moisture. To most, it was a miserable summer. To Moses, it was a signal. The ceiling was ready. The wood, weakened by his slow campaign, now swelled and shrank with each storm, straining joints designed to betray their master. On the 15th of that month, the day began heavy with humidity, the air thick as syrup. By evening, the sky broke open. Rain hammered slate roofs, lightning stitched the harbor, and thunder rolled with the weight of cannons. It was the kind of storm Barrett enjoyed most. He liked to retreat into his grand dining hall with a bottle of French brandy, savoring the sense of safety while chaos raged outside. The irony was perfect. A man boasting of security, unaware that his sanctuary was already a grave. At 8:30 that night, as always, Barrett settled beneath the central beam. His papers spread before him, his brandy glass catching lamplight. Numbers consumed his attention: debts, profits, accounts. He never looked up. Why would he? For 15 years the ceiling had kept its promise. Moses waited in the carriage house, still as a nail driven deep. When the first drops of rain drummed the roof, he rose. He crossed the garden in silence, every step rehearsed 100 times. He knew which boards would groan, which latches would betray. The storm's roar muffled all. From the shadow of the garden, he looked through the dining hall window. Barrett sat in his usual chair, head bent over figures, a man so confident in his permanence that he could not imagine the beams above him plotting treachery. The ceiling whispered first, a groan masked by thunder. Moses's trained ear caught it, oak fibers stretching past their limit. Another crack followed, sharp as a musket shot. Dust rained onto Barrett's papers. He looked up, confusion knitting his brow. He had no time to move. The massive beam Moses had so carefully prepared gave way, plunging downward like judgment itself. It struck Barrett across the shoulders, driving him face first into the ledger that had defined his life. Brandy shattered, papers scattered, and before Barrett could even gasp, the rest of the ceiling followed. Chandeliers crashed like falling stars. Oak and plaster roared into ruin. In 10 seconds, 15 years of work and suffering found their voice. Moses did not move. He waited, eyes fixed on the wreckage, listening for signs of life. There were none. Only the hiss of rain through broken windows, the slow settling of timber into silence. When he was certain, he turned away. He walked down the carriage road, into the storm that hid him as completely as if the night itself had chosen to protect him. He carried nothing but coins and memory. Behind him, the grandest room in Charleston had become a tomb, and its master lay beneath the very beams he had demanded. At the harbor, ships rocked against their moorings, their masts bowing in the storm's hand. Moses knew exactly which vessel awaited, Freedom's Dawn, bound for Haiti with the morning tide. He had studied its schedule, rehearsed its location in his dreams. Tonight, he would board not as Moses Carter, the enslaved carpenter, but as Matthew Freeman, a man no longer property. The storm raged, but for the first time in his life, Moses felt the rain not as weight, but as cleansing. Each drop washed away a fragment of the name Barrett had written over him. Ahead lay an ocean, a new world, and the uncertain, perilous gift of freedom. Behind him lay a coffin disguised as a dining hall and a story Charleston would never fully understand. Dawn broke over Charleston harbor as Freedom's Dawn slipped her moorings, sails straining against the remnants of the storm. On her deck, among merchants and weary families, stood a man cloaked in silence. He had purchased his passage with coins saved in secret, each one a nail pulled from his own cage. On the manifest, he was not listed as Moses Carter, slave of William Barrett. He was Matthew Freeman, a free man of color bound for Port-au-Prince. The ink itself felt like liberation. Behind him, Charleston shrank into the horizon, its church steeples and grand facades dissolving in the sea haze. Somewhere in that city, men would already be shouting over the ruins of the dining hall, their boots scraping plaster and timber as they pulled Barrett's broken body from the wreckage. They would blame the storm, the construction, God himself, anything but the possibility that a slave's genius had outwitted a master's arrogance. The voyage took 6 days. For the first time in years, Moses's hands touched wood not to serve Barrett's ambition, but to steady himself on the ship's railing. He watched dolphins race the vessel, their freedom cutting the water with effortless grace. Yet freedom sat heavy on him. He had imagined triumph, but what he felt was exhaustion. Nights brought dreams of splintering beams, of Barrett's face crushed into his ledger. Even at sea, he could not yet escape the house he had destroyed. Haiti rose from the horizon like a vision. This was no ordinary island, it was the world's first black republic, born of revolution. 30 years earlier, men who had been enslaved had risen with fire and steel, defeating Napoleon's armies and proclaiming liberty. Their names, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, were whispered with reverence among bondsmen across the Americas. Now Moses, calling himself Matthew Freeman, set foot on their soil. For the first time in his life, no one owned him. Port-au-Prince was a city alive with contradictions, streets buzzing with merchants, churches half rebuilt after earthquakes, children playing where cannon fire had once thundered. For a man with Moses's skills, there was no shortage of work. He found employment within a week repairing storm-damaged houses and carving pews for a parish church. Soon word spread. This Freeman had hands that could turn rough timber into beauty, beams into cathedrals of strength. Here he was no longer a tool for another man's pride. Here his work served communities, families, and God. Each plank he laid became an act of reclamation. Where once he had built monuments to a master's ego, he now built schools where black children learned to read, homes where families could sleep without fear of being sold at dawn. He married Celeste, a baker whose laughter carried the warmth of rising bread. Together they had children who would never be catalogued in a ledger. They lived in a modest house Moses built with his own hands, walls that echoed not with commands but with lullabies. Yet even in freedom, the past followed him. At night, the dreams returned. He saw Barrett, staring at him across the wreckage, lips moving though no breath remained. He awoke drenched in sweat, guilt gnawing at him, not regret for the act itself, but for its necessity. Could freedom ever be born without blood? Could justice ever be carved without violence? Haiti, however, gave him purpose beyond his nightmares. The island itself was proof that shackles could be broken. Every street corner hummed with resilience. Every market stall was a testament that survival could flower into dignity. And slowly, Moses learned to breathe again, not as property, not as fugitive, but as a man rebuilding himself beam by beam, the same way he had once rebuilt houses. He carried his new name like a shield, Matthew Freeman. The world might forget the slave called Moses Carter, but in Haiti the name Freeman would belong to a man who chose his destiny and carved it into the grain of history. 18 years passed. The Barrett mansion on Meeting Street stood diminished, its grand dining hall boarded up, a ruin whispered about by neighbors as if haunted. Charleston's elite avoided speaking of that Christmas Eve collapse, for it embarrassed the city's pride. Officially, it had been called an accident, faulty beams, heavy rains, bad luck. But whispers lingered, as whispers always do. In 1851, a young journalist named Jacob Richardson arrived in Charleston to research antebellum architecture for the Atlantic Monthly. He sought stories of Southern grandeur, the craftsmanship, the plantations, the opulent homes. Inevitably, his path led him to the Barrett property, where locals muttered of a cursed ceiling that had crushed its master. Intrigued, Richardson wanted more than folklore. He wanted testimony. His search brought him to a tavern near the waterfront, where he met Marcus Whitmore, once Barrett's overseer. Time had not been kind to Whitmore. At 73, his hands trembled from age and humidity, and his savings had dwindled with poor investments. Yet his memory was sharp, and when Richardson offered coin for recollections, Whitmore's cloudy eyes brightened. "You want to know about the collapse?" Whitmore rasped, leaning close across the scarred table. "Everyone does, sooner or later, but they don't want the truth. They want a ghost story. What they don't realize is this: the ghost was alive, and his name was Moses Carter." Richardson's pen stilled. Whitmore drank deep before continuing. "Moses weren't just another slave. Barrett paid $800 for him steep, even then. Worth every cent, though. That boy could look at a tree still in the ground and tell you what it'd be good for. Furniture, beams, firewood, you name it. He had hands like a master craftsman and eyes that remembered everything. Too much, maybe. He watched people, watched the way things fit together, wood, men, even lies." The overseer's voice dropped lower, heavy with memory. "Barrett treated him better than most, gave him privileges, but you can't polish chains into freedom. I saw it in Moses's eyes. Those privileges meant nothing. He was still owned, and ownership eats at a man." Richardson leaned forward. "Do you believe the ceiling fell by accident?" Whitmore was silent for a long while. His fingers traced the rim of his empty glass. Finally, he said, "No, I was there the night it came down. Heard the crash like thunder from my cottage. By the time I reached the hall, Barrett was dead and Moses was gone. Bed empty, belongings missing. A man don't vanish like that by chance. I went back to the ruins later, looked at the beams myself. It didn't add up. Joints cut wrong in ways too clever for carelessness. Weakness hidden where no eye but Moses's could find it. That ceiling was built to fall, and Moses built it." The words hung in the smoky tavern air like confession. Richardson felt his pulse quicken. If Whitmore spoke true, this was not merely a tale of tragedy, it was a story of rebellion, of a man who had used skill and patience to strike back against a master. But Whitmore wasn't finished. He leaned closer still, his voice almost a whisper. "And I'll tell you something else. That wasn't the first time. I'd heard of other accidents. A warehouse down in Savannah collapsed right on an owner who'd been cheating his workers. A church fire in Columbia. Strange how it started. Each time, Moses had been nearby. Folks chalked it to bad luck. But me, I saw a pattern. He knew how to make wood keep secrets. And maybe, just maybe, he used it." Richardson's pen raced, his notebook filling with words that felt heavier than ink. He had come to write about architecture. Instead, he had stumbled upon a hidden war, fought not with muskets, but with beams, nails, and patience. Whitmore sat back, exhausted, as if the confession had drained what little life he had left. "Most will never believe it," he muttered. "To them, Moses was just another runaway who slipped off in the chaos. But I know better. He didn't slip away. He walked out with a plan 15 years in the making." For Richardson, the story was no longer about Charleston's mansions. It was about one man whose genius had turned architecture into rebellion. And though Charleston had tried to bury the truth beneath timber and silence, the echoes of that collapse still spoke if one knew how to listen. Richardson's curiosity became obsession. Whitmore's words lit a fire that no polite account of Charleston's mansions could quench. He scoured records, plantation ledgers, ship manifests, correspondence. In the harbor master's office he found it. Freedom's Dawn departed Charleston the 16th of August, 1833. Among its passengers was one Matthew Freeman, a free man of color. The description, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, skilled carpenter, was too precise to be coincidence. Moses had not disappeared. He had remade himself. Letters led Richardson further, across the Caribbean. In Port-au-Prince, he heard of a craftsman named Freeman, whose reputation glowed like candlelight through paper. This man built schools, churches, homes. He trained apprentices. He purchased freedom for those still enslaved in the States. He was respected not just as a carpenter, but as a leader. To Haitians, he was proof of what emancipation could mean, skill turned toward community, not exploitation. The most startling discovery came not from rumor, but from family. Freeman's descendants preserved a set of journals, written in a careful hand by the man himself. Richardson, after months of negotiation, was granted access. What he found transformed the story from rumor into revelation. The journals spoke plainly. I built my freedom into the very beams of that hall. Page after page described methods so precise they bordered on artistry. He detailed how he shaved pegs so joints would loosen over time, how he introduced water into critical places to encourage swelling and contraction, how he filed metal supports until they held together by friction alone. Each act was not reckless, but calculated, a science of sabotage. Yet the journals were more than technical, they were philosophy. Moses called his campaign invisible warfare, a way to fight oppression without open revolt, to strike blows that looked like misfortune. He admitted to small acts long before Barrett's death, altering slave quarters so they trapped heat less brutally in summer, weakening whips and stocks so punishment tools failed in overseers' hands. He described a quiet network of skilled slaves across plantations, artisans who exchanged whispered instructions on how to bend their crafts toward mercy and resistance. A house can serve the master, he wrote, or it can shelter freedom. The difference is measured in inches, in choices no eye but ours can see. Moses did not glorify his work. He wrote of nightmares, of guilt, of the burden of carrying death in his hands. He questioned himself. Was he a liberator or a murderer? Did his actions invite harsher punishments for those left behind? He never found an easy answer. Freedom, he confessed, is a building whose foundations are always laid in blood. I chose whose blood it would be. Richardson realized he was holding something extraordinary, not just confession but a manifesto. The story, when published, ignited debate across the nation. Abolitionists hailed Moses Carter as proof of black genius and courage. Frederick Douglass himself wrote, "He turned the master's tool into the master's undoing." Southern papers called him a criminal, a warning that education and skill made slaves dangerous. The divide was stark, but one truth could not be buried. Moses Carter had existed, had planned, had triumphed. And in Haiti, Matthew Freeman's life went on. The journals described him building more than houses. He built institutions, trained apprentices, and bought back lives one by one from bondage. His workshop became known as the Freedom School, a place where boys once shackled learned both letters and craft. To them, he was not a runaway or a saboteur. He was proof that chains could be broken by patience as much as fire. The dining hall collapse had been a single night, but its echoes, carried in ink and memory, revealed a war far larger. A war fought beam by beam, invisible yet unyielding, until freedom became architecture itself. Moses Carter, now Matthew Freeman, grew old in a land that had been born of revolution. In Haiti, he was no longer property but a pillar. His hands, once compelled to build monuments to another man's vanity, now raised schools where children recited verses and churches where freedmen sang without fear. His apprentices spread across the island, carrying his techniques and his philosophy, that every nail and beam could serve liberation, not oppression. But Moses's legacy reached far beyond Port-au-Prince. Richardson's articles, bolstered by excerpts from the journals, rippled through the United States. To abolitionists, Moses was a hero who proved that intellect and patience could dismantle slavery's lies. To defenders of bondage, he was a specter, an enslaved man who turned mastery of craft into mastery over fate, striking terror into those who believed their houses eternal. Frederick Douglass, himself a fugitive turned orator, invoked Moses in fiery speeches. He built freedom into the rafters, Douglass declared. The master thought he owned a carpenter. In truth, the carpenter owned his fate. Abolitionist presses spread the story while Southern editors raged against it, branding Moses a murderer. Yet the name persisted, whispered in safe houses along the Underground Railroad, where runaways found courage in the tale of a man who had brought a master's house down. As decades passed, Moses's influence seeped into places he never walked. After the Civil War, black colleges and schools across the South rose on foundations both literal and symbolic that traced back to his philosophy. Build for community, build for freedom. Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute echoed Moses's creed, combining craft with dignity. During Reconstruction, former slaves became masons, carpenters, and teachers, their labor no longer a tool of bondage but a declaration of independence. Even the civil rights leaders of the 20th century found inspiration in his patience. Martin Luther King Jr., speaking in Charleston in 1963, reminded his audience, Moses Carter waited 15 years to strike his blow for freedom. He used that time not to despair, but to prepare. We too must have patience, but we must ensure our children do not wait as long for justice. Modern architects and engineers have since studied the collapse itself. Forensic analysis of the ruins confirmed what Whitmore suspected and Moses admitted. The failure was deliberate, crafted by a hand that understood structural weakness with uncanny precision. To scholars, it was both engineering and rebellion, a design that weaponized knowledge itself. Today, in Charleston, near where Barrett's mansion once stood, a historical marker tells the story not of William Barrett, the planter who owned bodies and sought immortality in timber and plaster, but of Moses Carter, the enslaved carpenter who transformed bondage into liberation. The plaque does not shy from the truth. The ceiling did not fall by chance. It fell because one man, denied freedom, built it into the very bones of the house. In Haiti, the workshop Moses founded still exists, reborn as a technical institute. Students from across the Caribbean study carpentry, architecture, and engineering there, unaware at times that the walls around them carry echoes of the night Charleston's proudest dining hall collapsed. Yet when their hammers strike wood, they continue his lesson, that skill can be resistance, and that the most beautiful structures are not those that glorify power, but those that shelter dignity. Moses Carter died in 1872, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew chains. His funeral filled the cathedral he himself had built, voices rising in hymns that wove grief with triumph. One of his first apprentices spoke the final words. His greatest legacy is not the ceiling he brought down, but the community he lifted up. And so his story endures. A man enslaved in body but never in spirit. A craftsman who taught oak to keep secrets, who bent wood toward freedom. A builder who proved that sometimes the most enduring monument is not a hall that stands tall, but one that falls at exactly the right moment. Every hammer strike in Haiti, every student who learns to shape wood in that island workshop, carries the echo of a night in Charleston when a ceiling came down, and with it, the illusion that ownership could last forever. Moses Carter built his freedom beam by beam, and in the end, it was not Barrett's mansion that survived history, but the story of the man who turned oppression into architecture and collapse into liberation.